Before we begin our journey on this peaceful night, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always delightful to discover where our listeners rest their heads as they travel with us through these old memories. The Carpenter and the Fallen House, new beginnings in the community. I remember well that foggy morning when the chapel bell rang earlier than usual. The air was heavy with the scent of wet wood and mud, and an uncanny silence hung over the village. I, just a carpenter with calloused hands and a toolbox inherited from my father, was summoned in haste. The Ferreira's house, one of the oldest and most respected families in the village, had collapsed during the night, brought down by the storm that had raged like a wild beast until the first light of day. When I arrived, I found not only broken planks and splintered beams, but also anxious faces. The walls that had once held stories, laughter, and shared meals now lay in ruins, buried in the sludge of the flood. I remember Donna Mariana, her trembling hands trying to save old photographs stained with water, while her husband paced in circles, murmuring quiet prayers. And there, before that scene of loss, I felt the weight not only of the wood that would need lifting, but also of the trust that everyone had placed in me. As I studied the wreckage, a cold breeze swept across the fields, carrying with it the familiar scent of freshly cut pine, mingling with the damp smell of churned earth. It was as if the village itself, silent and expectant, was asking me to act. I took a deep breath, touched the broken wood with my fingertips, and promised myself that somehow that house would rise again. Not merely out of skill or duty, but because I knew that every hammer strike would echo in the hearts of those who needed hope. Then the neighbors began to arrive. First Joachim, with his old wheelbarrow full of rusty tools, then Helena, carrying warm loaves of bread to sustain us as we worked. Even the children, with their small hands and curious eyes, offered to gather pieces of tile and sweep away the mud. Looking at them, I realized something no trade book or blueprint could ever teach. The true strength of a house lies not only in the hands that build it, but also in the shoulders that share the burden. We started from the foundation, clearing the mud and reinforcing the ground with stones brought from the river. Each strike of the shovel seemed to awaken the sleeping earth, while the rhythmic sound of tools filled the air like a strange melody of reconstruction. I could feel the cold biting at my fingertips, but also the quiet satisfaction of seeing each simple act. A well-placed nail, a beam set straight, slowly restore dignity to that home. And with every pause, the smell of Helena's freshly baked bread reminded us that even in the midst of chaos, there was still comfort. There were moments of silence among us, broken only by the distant crowing of a rooster or the crack of splitting wood. In those quiet times, I thought of my father, who had taught me never to see a job simply as work, but as a promise. He used to say that every house had a soul, and it was a carpenter's duty to listen to it before raising the walls. There, among shattered beams and scattered tiles, I realized that perhaps the soul of that house had not been destroyed, only waiting patiently for someone brave enough to restore it. On the second day, when the timid sun finally broke through the heavy clouds, I saw something change in the faces of the villagers. The expressions of fear and uncertainty gave way to faint smiles, as if each beam raised was a sign that better days were coming. Even Donna Mariana, still with trembling hands, began bringing buckets of clean water to help us mix the mortar. It was as though rebuilding that house was also rebuilding something invisible. Our faith that even after the storm, there was always a way back home. At night, exhausted, I would sit beside the unfinished structure, warmed only by a small fire. The smell of smoke mingled with that of cut wood, creating an odd sense of peace. I gazed at the skeleton of the new house, its beams already firm and straight, and I could almost hear a whisper from the walls, as if they were silently thanking us for bringing them back to life. In that moment, I understood that perhaps I was not only building a house, but also stitching together the bonds of an entire community. On the third day, the work felt almost like a celebration. Children ran among the piles of wood, carrying small pieces as if they were treasures. The men sawed and hammered with determination, while the women prepared hot meals that perfumed the air with vegetable broth and freshly baked rye bread. The sound of hammers blended with occasional laughter, and I realized that, little by little, the village was no longer seeing the disaster as a tragedy, but as an opportunity to unite hearts and hands. Yet there were moments when fatigue weighed on us. I remember one particularly cold afternoon when the wind seemed to cut through our skin and the threat of rain loomed again. I sat down for a moment, leaning against a beam, and watched my neighbors working around me. That's when I felt something strange, a warmth that didn't come from the fire but from their presence, from the way they shared their strength without asking for anything in return. And in that instant, I understood that sometimes the true home isn't just in wooden walls, it's in the people who lift one another up. When we finally installed the first tiles, a reverent silence fell over the village. Each piece set into place felt like a small triumph, and even the simplest gesture, holding a ladder for a neighbor or passing a tool, carried deep meaning. Donna Mariana wept quietly as she saw the roof taking shape, and her husband, a man of few words, only nodded with tearful eyes, as if that moment proved that no misfortune was strong enough to break the spirit of a united community. That same night, we all gathered around a great bonfire. The sky was clear, and the stars seemed to watch over our small village. The scent of burning wood mingled with that of hot soup, and for a moment there was no rush, only the quiet serenity of those who know that even in the face of great loss, it is always possible to begin again. I looked at my calloused hands, covered in sawdust, and felt a calm pride. Perhaps the house was not yet finished, but something far more important had already been rebuilt. On the fourth day, with the walls firm and the roof secure, we turned to the details. The windows were carefully fitted to let the light in, and the wooden floor received its first polish. Every hammer strike, every perfect joint seemed to return a little of the old joy to that home. The children peeked through the cracks, imagining what it would be like to run from room to room once it was all complete. And as I watched them, I couldn't help but smile. There was something sacred in that simplicity, as if rebuilding was also a ritual of hope. Then came the most symbolic moment, raising the main beam of the living room. Everyone helped. Men, women, even the elderly leaning on their canes, held a piece of the wood. When the beam finally locked into place, a spontaneous applause rang out, mingling with the sound of the chapel bells, which someone, overcome with emotion, had begun to ring. In that instant, I realized we weren't just rebuilding the Ferreira's house. We were rebuilding the story of all of us, written in wood, sweat, and solidarity. In the days that followed, we focused on the finishing touches. We painted the walls with a simple mixture of lime and water, its fresh scent spreading through the air, reminding everyone that the change was complete. The oak doors creaked softly as they were installed, as if the house itself were breathing a sigh of relief. And when we finally hung the small wooden cross above the entrance, I felt a shiver of satisfaction. It wasn't just a symbol, it was a promise of new beginnings. On the afternoon we handed the house back to the family. The sun shone with unusual generosity for that time of year. Donna Mariana gripped my hand tightly, her eyes glistening with gratitude, while her children ran through the rooms, laughing as if they had never known the weight of a storm. And in that moment, surrounded by neighbors, laughter, and the smell of fresh bread someone had brought to celebrate, I understood something simple and eternal. No matter how many times the walls may fall, there will always be hands ready to lift them up again. That night, back in my workshop, I sat by the hearth as the crackle of the fire filled the silence. The scent of freshly cut wood still clung to my clothes, and my aching fingers bore the marks of every effort. But in the midst of my fatigue, there was a deep peace. I closed my eyes and could still hear, in my memory, the joyful voices of the village and the sound of the bells ringing in celebration. It was as if the night itself was cradling me, reminding me that in the end, it had all been worth it. And so, as the flames danced softly and the night breeze slipped through the half-open window, I realized that the storm, despite everything, had left us with a quiet gift. Not just a rebuilt house, but a renewed bond among neighbors, friends, and hearts. I smiled to myself with that quiet contentment that only comes when you know something has truly been mended. Because, deep down, every plank raised and every beam set was more than carpentry. It was memory, hope, and the certainty that in our little village, no one would ever be alone. The young weaver and the worn cloth, work and quiet dreams. I remember well the sound of the looms, a steady rhythm that seemed to match the beating of my own heart. The room was small, with cold stone walls and narrow windows where sunlight slipped through in golden strips, falling upon the spools of thread like shy rays of hope. The air carried the faint, sweet scent of washed wool and dried herbs hanging from the beams, as if someone had tried in vain to perfume away the weariness. I was only a young girl then, seated before my loom from the first light of dawn, while outside the village stirred to life with hurried footsteps and voices echoing through the narrow streets. Sometimes, as my tired but nimble fingers intertwined the threads, I allowed myself to dream. I would gaze beyond the window and imagine the hills outside the village, the woods where the wind played with the leaves, and the rivers that never stopped their endless course. Simple dreams, perhaps, but they sparkled like tiny fragments of light in the grey monotony, and yet every time a knock came at the door with another order for cloth, reality pressed in, a few coins for long hours of work, and always the same questions about when I would finally marry, as though my life were nothing but a bolt of fabric waiting for the final cut. There were nights when, after putting away my tools and extinguishing the lamp, I would remain seated before the silent loom. The threads hung loose, as if they shared in my exhaustion. In those moments the world felt suspended. I could hear only the distant creak of wooden houses swaying in the wind and the soft call of a solitary owl. And in those pauses, I imagined what it might be like to walk aimlessly down the roads beyond the village. No needles, no threads, no weight of traditions binding my life in stitches pulled too tight. Yet there was a strange tenderness in my routine. Each morning, when I sank my fingers into the spools of wool, I felt a softness that reminded me of an old, quiet kindness. There was comfort in the pull of the threads, in the predictable hum of the loom, like a song so old and familiar it had nearly become silence. Even in my weariness, I found solace in those small gestures. And perhaps it was that fragile, almost invisible solace that kept me from abandoning the very threads that held my life, and, in some way, my dreams, together. Some mornings began with a visit from old Mistress Merilda, who always brought a piece of dark bread wrapped in cloth. She would stand in the doorway, leaning on her cane, and gaze at my loom as though it were an old companion. "Threads are like life, girl," she would say with a smile lined with more wrinkles than teeth. "Pull them too hard, and they break. Leave them too loose, and they lose their shape." I would only smile back, tucking her words away like a quiet secret. At the market, my cloths hung in the breeze, and I stood behind them, timid and half-hidden. The coins dropped slowly into my small wooden box, each chime sounding less like success and more like survival. Yet there was comfort in watching the housewives feel the fabric between their fingers, the men measuring it with their practical eyes, and even the children darting between stalls, laughing and scattering dust over the stone-paved ground. Somehow I felt I belonged to all of it. Unseen, perhaps, but necessary, like a thread no one notices until it's gone from the weave. Sometimes, as I wound the threads at the end of the day, my mind wandered beyond the village walls. I imagined distant lands where work did not begin with the sun and end only when the stars had long claimed the sky. In those silent daydreams, I walked freely, my hair loose in the wind, my hands free of calluses, and no one reminding me it was time to think of marriage or children. It was only me, the world, and a sky too vast to measure. But when the crackling fire pulled me back, I smiled softly, almost tenderly. Not because I had given up my dreams, but because there was beauty even in what seemed small. Every piece of cloth I finished carried not only threads of wool, but also strands of patience and hope. And, in a quiet way, I felt that even if I never left that village, my threads might travel farther than I ever could. One day, a merchant from distant lands stopped at my stall. He didn't say much, only touched one of the fabrics gently, as if weighing more than just the quality of the wool. Then he looked at me and smiled, calm and knowing. "There is something different in this one," he murmured. He paid without haggling, and before leaving added, "Those who weave with their hearts stitch destinies they may never see." His words echoed in me for many nights, like a distant bell ringing through the fog. That week, as the threads piled on my table, I realized that every small gesture, every knot tied well, every line drawn taut, carried a piece of me. And maybe that was why I endured, even when my body ached, and the village seemed to expect nothing of me but silence and obedience. If I could not change the world outside, I could at least embroider my memory into the fabric of my work. A quiet defiance stitched between the lines. One particularly cold night, I sat by the window with an unfinished shawl over my knees. Outside, the moon seemed to pour silver over the rooftops, and the village slept under a silence so deep that even the mill's creaking sounded like a whisper. I closed my eyes and ran my hand across the threads, feeling them as though they were tiny veins of memory. I had no answers, no promises of easier days, but in that instant I found a curious kind of peace. As if, for a moment, the simple act of weaving was enough to hold the world in place. In time, I learned to see poetry even in the worn places. The rough tips of my fingers became a map of everything I had built. Every callus, every pulled thread told the story of a life that was simple, but not empty. And as the night wind slipped through the cracks of the window and stirred the spools of yarn, I felt that, among threads and dreams, I too was being woven, not only as a young weaver, but as someone who, without noticing, had learned to entwine hope even into the most frayed patterns of life. One day, a little girl from the village came to me with a torn piece of cloth. Her eyes were wide and pleading, her small hands trembling as she held it out. "Can you fix it?" she asked, with the innocence of someone who still believes that everything in the world can be mended. I smiled and invited her to sit by my side. As I stitched the fabric, I told her stories of invisible threads that bind destinies, and she listened as though each word was a charm. When I finished, her eyes shone brighter than the mended cloth itself. After she left, I sat quietly, staring at the closed door, thinking of how sometimes it was not the cloth that needed mending, but the one who carried it. In some small way, repairing fabric also stitched a little courage into other people's lives. And without knowing it, it mended me too. Perhaps that was why, even in my exhaustion, I could never abandon my loom. In each simple repair there was something quietly grand, as if for a brief moment the world itself remembered how to breathe. As the seasons passed, I began to read life in the rhythm of the threads. Winter brought thick wool and long nights by the fire. Spring, bright colors and threads so fine they almost slipped through my fingers. Summer, with cloths drying in the sun and the warm smell of wool mingling with the scent of flowers carried down from the hills. And autumn, when the fallen leaves covered the ground like nature's own tapestry. And in those quiet repetitions, never empty, I discovered a strange kind of freedom, not the freedom of travelers, nor of those who cast everything aside to start anew, but the gentle freedom of turning small things into something that endures. For even if my cloths wore thin, just as I did, there was always another thread waiting, and with it another chance to begin again, line by line, stitch by stitch. Perhaps that was why I continued, because even the smallest dreams, if carefully tended, can outlast any tradition. One afternoon, as I gathered my spools of wool, I heard laughter in the street. Children were running by with pieces of my fabric tied around their shoulders like capes, pretending to be kings and knights. For a moment, I only stood at my doorway and watched, a soft laugh escaping my lips. They weren't fine or costly fabrics, but in the wind they became something greater, small improvised dreams that gave color to our quiet village days. And in that moment, it felt worth more than any coin. That night, I sat before my loom and touched the threads with care, almost in gratitude. The crackling fire, the distant hum of a cricket, and the pale moonlight spilling through the window formed a quiet symphony. I thought of all the cloths I had woven, scattered in homes I might never see, and for the first time I realized that even without leaving, I had left pieces of myself in many places. In silence, I had not only woven garments and shawls, but memories no one could ever unravel. Over time, I came to see my loom not merely as a tool, but as a silent companion. Every mark on its wood, every thread snagged in haste, carried a part of my story. And while the old voices of the village still murmured of marriages and duties, I found my own way of existing, in the threads I wove, in the cloths that warmed strangers, in a quiet life I had learned, almost without noticing, to love. And so, on a night when snow covered the rooftops like a pale blanket, I understood something. It was not fate that limited me, but the way I chose to weave it. I smiled to myself, pulled a shawl around my shoulders, and let the fire's golden light fall across the threads still stretched upon my loom. For in truth, every stitch was a step, and every cloth a small miracle. Silent proof that even the most modest dreams, if patiently woven, can become something everlasting. And that night, before I blew out the lamp, I ran my hand across the threads as one might caress a cherished memory. There was no rush, no demand, only the distant sound of the wind and the quiet certainty that even within the limits of my small life, I had found something greater, something no market could sell, no tradition could bind. The peace of knowing that every thread I wove had also gently mended my own heart. I closed my eyes, listening to the fire's soft crackle, and let its warmth settle over the room. Outside, the world was unchanged, with all its same demands and expectations. And yet, within me, something had shifted. Perhaps I would never leave the village. Perhaps my dreams would never stretch as far as the wide skies I imagined. And still, I smiled. For I had learned that even in the most worn-out patterns, beauty could be embroidered. And there, between threads and silence, I drifted into sleep, wrapped in my own quiet tapestry of hope. The hunter and the fangless winter, survival and hard choices. I remember a winter so harsh that even the wind seemed to hurt. Snow fell without end, covering the forest with a white, heavy silence, as if the world itself had paused to breathe. At that time, I lived in a small wooden cabin, far from the village, warmed only by a stubborn hearth and the lingering scent of burning pine that clung to the walls. It was a season when men learned to measure their steps and count every grain of oats. And it was in that winter that I faced the trials of a hunter with no prey to hunt. The mornings were long and pale, and when I opened the cabin door, all I could see was a vast expanse of ice and bare trees, as still as ancient statues. No footprints, no sound, only the distant creak of branches twisted by the wind. My traps, once full of restless life, lay empty, covered only by a thin veil of fresh snow. In that silence, even my stomach seemed to roar louder, reminding me that the forest, generous in other seasons, could just as easily become an unforgiving desert. I turned to the old, tattered maps I kept rolled up in a corner of the cabin, drawn by the hands of hunters who had come before me. Red marks pointed to familiar hunting grounds, while black strokes warned of places where few dared to venture. The dangerous territory lay to the north beyond the frozen river, where the forest grew denser and the stories darker. They said that there the wolves hunted in silence, and even the deer, when seen, had eyes as black as the night itself. And yet, hunger left no room for hesitation. I traced the marks on the map with calloused fingers while the fire cracked in the hearth, sending golden sparks into the cold air. My bow hung on the wall like an old, trusted companion, and when I touched it, I felt a strange comfort. Preparing for the hunt, even with an empty forest, was a ritual that reminded me of who I was. Not merely a starving man, but someone willing to face the snow, the solitude, and even fear itself if need be. The next morning, the sky was a deep, metallic gray, and the wind cut like thin blades. I fastened the fur hood beneath my chin, adjusted the quiver on my back, and stepped across the threshold of the cabin. Each step on the snow groaned as if echoing through the entire valley. The frozen river stretched before me, smooth and treacherous, with thin, spider-like cracks that seemed to watch me in threatening silence. I drew a deep breath, feeling the cold bite at my lungs, and began the crossing. When I reached the other side, the forest changed. The trees were taller there, pressed close together, casting long, twisted shadows over the snow. A strange scent hung in the air, not the clean smell of ice, but something heavier, wilder, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. I tightened my grip on the bough, alert to every sign. Every snapping twig, every whispering gust of wind seemed to murmur old stories of men who had entered and never returned. I moved carefully, following almost invisible tracks in the snow, perhaps deer prints, though they vanished under the deep shadows of the trees. The silence was so complete that the sound of my own heartbeat felt like an intruder. At times it seemed the forest was watching me, weighing each step, deciding whether I was an intruder or just another desperate soul among many who had passed this way. When I finally saw movement, it was not the promise of prey I expected. A lone wolf stared at me from afar, its eyes glowing like embers in the whiteness. It did not growl nor advance. It only watched, unmoving, like a living statue. For a moment, I felt something akin to mutual respect. We were both creatures of winter, each of us fighting for a share of survival in the same realm of snow and hunger. After a few moments, the wolf turned and vanished into the trees, unhurried, as if it had decided I wasn't worth the effort. I breathed deeply and pressed on, but that brief exchange of glances stayed with me, etched in the snow. Further on, I found fresh deer tracks, sharp enough to kindle a spark of hope in my chest. I followed them carefully, making sure the snow did not betray my presence with a careless crunch. The tracks led me to a narrow clearing where a lone deer grazed under the shade of a twisted pine, thin and wary, much like me. I laid my hand on the bough, feeling the cold wood beneath my fingers, and readied myself to shoot. But then, a sudden wind swept through the clearing, carrying with it something older than hunger, the instinct that this might not be the day to kill. Slowly, I lowered my bow and simply watched the animal, which raised its head and met my gaze with an almost human calm. I stood there for a long while the deer, unafraid, moved slowly on through the snow. In that silence, I understood that the forest was not just a place to hunt. It was a mirror, harsh and honest, showing what we are when nothing else remains. Hunger still burned in my belly, but there was also a strange peace, As if by sparing that life, I had preserved something within myself that winter could not take. I turned homeward then, my steps steady and my heart lighter than before. I carried no meat, no pelts, only the echo of a choice that somehow felt larger than survival itself. When I finally reached my cabin, the fire was still burning, scattering tiny golden sparks into the dim air. I sat before it, and while the wind howled outside, I closed my eyes and let the warmth and crackling of the flames remind me that sometimes survival is not just hunting, but knowing how to wait. In the days that followed, I learned to live with less. I gathered roots buried beneath the snow, dried strips of bark, and made broth so thin they barely had flavor. But they warmed the body enough to quiet the hunger. The deer I had spared returned sometimes to the edge of the clearing, as if it knew that for a fleeting moment we had shared a silent truce. Watching it from a distance became an odd comfort, a reminder that not every winter is made only of hardship. There are small mercies too, hidden under the frost. And so, when spring finally came, it brought not only flowers and thawing rivers, but also the quiet sense that I had passed through something greater than hunger or cold, an unseen trial from which I emerged not stronger, but quieter, more watchful. Because sometimes survival is not about conquering the forest, but learning to walk within it without losing your soul. And that morning, when the first bird sang above my cabin, I swear its song sounded like the answer I had been waiting for all winter. That night, seated by the fire, I heard the river in the distance, free at last from the ice, murmuring like an ancient lullaby. The smell of burning wood filled the cabin, and the flames cast their dancing shadows on the walls, as if winter itself was silently bidding me farewell. I closed my eyes, and for a moment I could almost feel the forest breathing again, alive and generous, as if forgiving me for having feared it so much. And when I laid my head upon the rough linen pillow, there was no more urgency, no emptiness, only the quiet certainty that even in the longest winters there is always something that sustains us. A lone deer in the clearing, a stubborn fire in the hearth, or the hope that survives within us. And so I fell asleep, listening to the night as one listens to an old story, knowing that at the end of every winter there will always be a gentler beginning. The village brewer and the secret of the recipe, tradition and community. I remember well those cold nights when the entire village seemed to fit inside the small wooden hall where Helga, the brewer, practiced her craft. The sweet, slightly bitter aroma of malt drifted through the air, mingling with the scent of wood crackling in the hearths, warming bodies and hearts alike. There was something almost sacred in the way she stirred the large copper cauldron, with slow, deliberate gestures, as if she carried an ancient story in her hands. Every movement felt like a silent prayer, each drop a secret passed down from mothers and grandmothers who never dared write the recipe, fearing that words on paper would rob the tradition of its soul. Helga was a woman with an easy laugh and eyes that held the glow of autumn, golden, warm, yet tinged with a hint of melancholy. They said she recognized every villager by the way they held their mug. For those who came distressed, she served a heartier brew to settle the soul and steady the feet, as she liked to say. For those celebrating, she offered something lighter, with notes of honey and herbs, enough to prolong joy until dawn. I still recall watching her seated on a bench by the fire and thinking that Helga was not merely a brewer. She was the guardian of our village's spirit. The walls of her workshop were lined with bundles of barley hanging to dry and small sacks of hops tied with string, each marked with symbols only she understood. In the center stood the great copper cauldron, polished with almost maternal care, reflecting the hearth's flames and casting dancing lights across the smoke-darkened ceiling. There was always a gentle hum, the fire's crackle, the beer's bubble, and the restrained laughter of those helping carry barrels or wash mugs after a good feast. To us children, The place felt part alchemy, part magic, and watching Helga work was like glimpsing a forbidden secret. Yet not everything was so simple. There was always someone in the village murmuring that Helga should change, that times called for something new, something bolder to attract traders from distant lands. But Helga simply smiled and said that tradition need not compete with novelty. It only needed to endure. Beer is like memory, she once confided as she slowly stirred with her enormous wooden spoon. If you change everything at once, you risk forgetting the taste of your own story. On winter nights, when snow blanketed the rooftops and the wind moaned through door cracks, it was around Helga that the village gathered. The candlelit hall came alive with stories told between sips and laughter, children nodding off on their parents' laps, lulled by the fire's warmth and the steady murmur of voices. In those moments, Helga's beer seemed more than a mere drink. It was an invisible thread, sewing us all together, uniting old and young, rich and poor, in a shared flavor that reminded us of who we were. But as years passed, travelers arrived from other regions, bearing exotic recipes and promises of more refined flavors. Some of the village youth, curious and impatient, began to question why Helga didn't follow suit. I recall one night when a wealthy merchant, barrel gleaming, mocked our old brewer before everyone. Helga merely chuckled softly as one listens indulgently to a child's talk of things not yet understood, then offered him a generous mug. In the silence that followed his first sip, even the merchant found no words. Helga never took offense at criticism. On the contrary, she welcomed each remark as if it were just another story to preserve. "Let them talk," she'd say, adjusting the barley bundles above the hearth. "Tradition has a quiet, steady voice. Those with patience will hear it." And indeed, whenever a new flavor passed through the village, brought by merchants or adventurers, curiosity lasted but a moment, a single festival, a collective toast around the great wooden table, and everyone returned to Helga's beer as though coming home after a long journey. Once back when I was young, I asked her what made her recipe so special. Helga gave me a sidewise smile, that expression mixing tenderness and a well-kept secret. She invited me to follow her to the back of her workshop, where a small wooden chest, marked by generations of calloused hands, lay resting. Inside were no books or scrolls with precise formulas, only little sacks of dried herbs, strips of tree bark and smooth river stones, each holding meanings she never needed to explain. "It's not the recipe," she whispered. "It's the memory of those who prepared it before me." After that night, I watched Helga with even greater admiration. When she stirred the cauldron, it wasn't just the malt transforming. It was as if each motion was a gesture of gratitude to those who came before her. There was a ceremonial rhythm, marked by the gentle clink of the wooden spoon against copper rims, and the fragrance weaving through the room, combining toasted barley, honey, and something ineffable. Perhaps memory itself, if memory had a scent. Village festivals were always the pinnacle of her craft. I remember one celebration when the harvest was abundant and everyone vowed to revel until dawn. Helga poured mug after mug with endless patience, her eyes shining with silent contentment. She drank little, just a careful wetting of the lips now and then, but seemed intoxicated by others' joy. And when the music ended, leaving only echoes of laughter and shuffling feet, she remained, gathering empty mugs and smiling as though witnessing a small miracle repeating itself. It was around that time I first heard rumors that some young villagers intended to brew their own beer. Not out of malice, but impatience. They wanted something bolder, something to rival the road merchants. When I told Helga, she gave a soft, almost maternal laugh. "Let them try," she said, blowing a wisp of foam from an overflowing barrel. "Some lessons only time and taste can teach." And so they did. The boys spent long nights boiling kettles, blending exotic ingredients, often spilling more beer on the floor than they bottled. When they finally presented their brew to the village, everyone tasted it politely. but something was off, something lacking. It wasn't bad, just soulless. Generously, Helga raised her mug to them and took a sip. "You've made beer," she said, in a voice that felt like a caress. "Now wait a few winters and do it again. Only then will it learn to remember." Over time, the young men returned to Helga's hall, carrying barley sacks and washing barrels as if they'd always belonged there. Helga never shut her door to anyone. On the contrary, she said that every pair of hands that touched the cauldron added something invisible to the beer, as though laughter and stories themselves blended into the brew. "That's how tradition grows stronger," she'd murmur, serene. "It's not just flavor, it's the memory of all who keep it alive." I recall a night when snow fell silently and the hall brimmed with villagers. Helga lifted her mug, and in a voice that seemed to warm even the cold walls said, "May we never lack bread or beer, and may we never stop toasting one another." It was a simple moment, yet it etched itself into me like an ancient seal. In that toast there was no hurry, no rivalry, only the comforting certainty that we were all exactly where we belonged. There was also a small ritual known only to the eldest. On the eve of the winter solstice, Helga brewed a special batch using a handful of herbs she gathered at the forest's edge. No one knew precisely which, and no one dared ask. At night's end, once everyone was sated and candles burned low, she offered the final round only to those who remained. "For those who wait with patience," she'd say, as mugs clinked softly. And somehow, that beer always tasted different, as if it carried the very silence of the falling snow. It was on one such night that I realized Helga did more than make beer. She wove the village's story, one winter at a time. Each batch was a bottled memory, each toast a thread binding us together. Thus, even when some departed, the sense of belonging endured. It was as if, while Helga stirred her cauldron, the outside world could pause. Through the years, Helga's steps grew slower, but her presence remained unwavering, like the river's steady flow in spring. Even when her hands trembled, no one dared replace her. Instead, the younger ones stepped forward to help, spoon in hand next to her, learning each movement with the reverence of a prayer. "Don't stir in haste," she cautioned, smiling. "Beer needs to feel that you have time." And so it was, amid laughter and stacked barrels, that the tradition not only survived but flourished. The village might gain new roofs, more visitors, or even more coins in circulation, but none of that changed the fact that when cold came and chimney smoke curled skyward, we all gathered around Helga. Her beer was not merely a drink, it was a reminder that the past is not lost. It simply blends into the present, like foam resting softly atop amber liquid. One night, when wind whistled through window cracks and the moon peeked from behind clouds, Helga invited me to sit by her side. She offered a still warm mug, and with that serene smile said, "One day, this recipe will no longer be mine. It will be yours." Her words held no sadness, only calm certainty, as if she fully trusted the continuity of something far greater than any one person. I took a sip, and for a moment I could almost hear voices of past generations whispering in the foam. It was not just barley and hops, it was liquid memory, an inheritance not stored in vaults, but in hands willing to serve. And that night, looking at Helga and all who filled the hall with laughter and stories, I felt we were witnessing something immortal. Not by defying time, but by letting ourselves be carried through it, winter after winter. As years passed, Helga's steps slowed further, yet she never missed a night at the hall. Even when she no longer stirred the cauldron alone, she sat by the fire, overseeing every detail with the same attentive gaze. And each time a new batch was served, she raised her mug slowly, toasted everyone and whispered, "As long as there are hands to stir and hearts to remember, this recipe will never die." It was then I understood that Helga was not just the village brewer. She was the guardian of something invisible, a silent bond that kept us united, even as seasons changed and life led us away. And still today, when I close my eyes and catch a distant scent of malt and honey, I return to that candlelit hall and hear Helga's gentle voice, reminding me that some traditions need not be reinvented. They only need to be loved. Now, many winters later, Helga is no longer with us, but her presence still hovers over every toast. The hall remains full, and the recipe, preserved with the same care, passes from hand to hand like a silent gift. Sometimes, when someone pours the first mug of the evening, they swear they feel a subtle warmth, as if an old friend smiled from some invisible corner, content to see her art still alive. And so we continue, season after season, amid laughter, stories, and leisurely sips. Perhaps that is what keeps us together, the certainty that as long as there is a steaming mug of beer, there will also be a home to return to. And when snow falls outside and wind knocks at the windows, one simple toast is enough for all of us to feel again the comfort of Helga's voice, and know that some memories never fade, they simply grow softer, like foam resting peacefully atop an ancient barrel. The Boy and the Stolen Book, Education and Punishment in the Middle Ages. I remember well that cold night when the candles in the church flickered like tiny stars caught in a wind of stone and silence. The boy, thin as the village winters, had eyes full of a hunger that was not for bread but for letters. The floorboards creaked beneath his bare feet, and the air was thick with the scent of wax and parchment, that smell only books carry, something between the dust of centuries and the promise of hidden worlds. He believed that if he could claim just one page for himself, he might escape a fate that would never allow him to know more than the soil beneath his nails. That night, the moon, shy behind the clouds, seemed to watch his crime with a pale, almost complicit glow. The book lay on the side altar, bound in leather, heavy as if the stories themselves had body and weight. The boy's hands trembled, not merely from fear of being caught, but from the awe of touching something forbidden. And as his fingers closed around that precious treasure, the echo of footsteps rang through the stone corridor, firm, solemn steps carrying the grave voice of a world that forgave no small thieves, even those who stole only dreams. Father Matthias was the first to find him. His elongated shadow, cast by the torches, fell over the boy like a night without stars. He neither shouted nor yanked the book from his hands. He simply looked at him with those weary eyes that had witnessed sins far greater than this. Yet there was something in his voice when he said only "come," heavier than any physical punishment. The boy pressed the book to his chest as if it were a stolen loaf to stave off starvation. And in a way, perhaps it was. It was only a few steps to the small sacristy, but to the boy they felt like 1,000. The air inside was cold and smelled of dormant incense, as if the very place guarded too many secrets to speak. The priest set the book on the oak table, and for a moment simply watched him. There was no anger on his face, only silent sorrow, and that was far worse. "Do you know what you've done?" he asked in a low voice, as though afraid to wake the walls themselves. The boy said nothing. He lowered his gaze, feeling shame's heat rise in his cheeks like a live ember. Father Matthias sighed, a long, weary sound, like one who carries the weight of many lives beyond his own. "Books are not toys for hands like yours," he murmured, but without harshness. He pulled a chair and sat before the boy, who remained motionless, like a cornered creature. "Tell me, why did you steal it?" His question hung in the air like the chill of dawn. The boy lifted his eyes for a single moment, revealing a mix of fear and desire. "I just wanted to know what was inside." The priest studied him long and hard, as if trying to see through the boy's dirt-smudged skin to find the spark of hope hidden in his chest. Knowledge carries a price, he said, running his hand gently over the book's cover as though petting a rare animal. And sometimes the ones who pay aren't you, but those who guard it. The boy said nothing, but his fingers still trembled, no longer from fear, but from something new. The suspicion that a world larger than the village and its rotting wooden fences might indeed exist. Then, without haste, Father Matthias opened the book. The pages exhaled the scent of ancient dust and aged ink, a perfume that seemed to contain the passage of centuries itself. The letters, drawn with almost sacred patience, danced before the boy's eyes like tiny riddles. He could not read, but that did not stop him from gazing with reverence as one might before a reliquary. The priest turned to him and spoke softly. Seeing is not the same as understanding, but even looking can be a beginning. The boy swallowed hard. No one had ever spoken to him that way, without shouting, without lashes, without that bitter certainty that he had no right to anything. For the first time, someone offered him not only reproach, but something like possibility. Father Matthias closed the book slowly and removed it from the table. Still, what you did must be made right, he declared. Then, instead of punishing him with rod or public shame, the priest handed him a broom. Clean the church floor until it shines. Let each shard of wood teach you the patience a book demands. The boy made no complaint. He took the broom with trembling hands and began to sweep, while the priest remained seated in silence, watching. The sound of bristles against boards echoed softly, almost like a wordless song. Each stroke lifted the dust time had laid down, and bit by bit, the shame in his chest transformed into something else, a kind of humble calm. For the first time he felt that perhaps there was a path for him beyond punishment and hunger, even if that path began with a broom rather than a book. When he finished, the church floor reflected the candlelight like a tranquil lake. The priest approached, laid his hand on the clean wood, and with a slight nod of approval said simply, "Good." He then turned to the boy and added, "If you wish to learn, come after Mass. I cannot give you this book, but I can give you letters, one at a time." The boy's eyes widened, uncertain whether he had heard correctly. In that instant, beneath the church's cold vaulted ceiling and the stern gaze of painted saints, something ignited within him. A small flame, as fragile as a candle, yet enough to illuminate the dark. That night, as he left the church, the world seemed different. The stones of the street, worn by centuries of footsteps, no longer felt so hard beneath his feet. The moon, high in the sky, poured its silver light over the thatched rooftops, as if blessing the secret he now carried in his heart. He had no book, but he possessed something he had never had before, a promise, and that promise was made of invisible letters, still unknown, but already dancing before his eyes like distant stars. In the days that followed, the boy returned always after Mass, his hands still dirt-streaked and his spirit restless with curiosity. Father Matthias received him with a brief nod and placed before him a scrap of parchment and a worn charcoal stick. "A," the priest would write slowly, and the boy would copy, tracing crooked, almost childish lines, yet filled with silent devotion. With each letter learned, he felt less invisible, as if the world at last began to recognize that he existed. In time, the sacristy became a secret refuge. While the village bustled outside with its harsh routines, inside reigned a peaceful silence, broken only by the charcoal's whisper over parchment. Occasionally, the priest would tell simple tales, parables and old legends he himself had learned in youth. The boy listened with wide eyes, hoarding every word as though they were precious coins. And though he still could not decipher the book's mysteries alone, he began to dream of the day when he would no longer merely listen, but actually read. One evening, after a brief lesson, the priest let slip a rare smile. "You learn quickly," he said, handing the boy another scrap of parchment as though giving a gift. "Perhaps one day you will read the very book you tried to steal." The boy laughed shyly, his cheeks flushing, and for the first time, that blush held no shame, only hope. As he snuffed the candle and closed the door behind him, he heard the night wind whisper through the cracks, as if the village itself, in its stern stillness, approved of that small miracle. Weeks turned into months, and each visit to the church was one more firm step toward a larger world. The boy, once just another forgotten face, now walked the lanes with a different light in his eyes. The neighbors, puzzled and murmuring, watched him, some with suspicion, others with a strange respect. After all, there was something almost sacred about someone who dared to learn, even if the village's rules said he had no right to it. One afternoon, while sweeping the church floor again, the boy paused before the very book he had once stolen. He dared not touch it, but stood there studying it, and he realized he no longer felt the same urgent need to snatch it from the altar and flee. Now he knew that with patience and effort, he would one day open it without fear or guilt and understand every word. He smiled to himself, confident in that quiet assurance only born when one discovers that learning itself is an act of freedom. That night, walking home, the boy strolled slowly, letting the cold winter breeze kiss his face. Every stone underfoot felt lighter, as though his steps were no longer bound solely by the earth's hardness, but lifted by the promise of something greater. Passing the old well in the village square, he glimpsed his reflection in the dark water and barely recognized himself. Not because his appearance had changed, but because in his eyes there shone a spark that neither hunger nor poverty could extinguish. Father Matthias, from the church tower above, watched the boy disappear among the houses. He said nothing, simply closed the window and extinguished his candle, as though fully trusting that newly woven thread of destiny. He knew the world would remain harsh for the boy, that more doors would stay closed than open, but he also knew no one could take away what the boy had begun to learn. For when someone learns to read, they also learn to dream, and even in the Middle Ages, dreams could not be stolen. Years later, many would still recall the boy who one night dared to steal a book from the church, not as a thief, but as someone brave enough to long for more than life offered. The boy grew, mastering not only letters but stories and prayers, and with them discovering that the world did not end at the village's borders. And though he remained poor, no one could call him miserable once he carried within him a library of dreams. And I, who witnessed it all, never forgot that first night when he held the book with trembling hands and hungry eyes. Today, as I recount this tale, I feel again the gentle warmth of a candle shielded from the wind. Because in the end, it was not merely a book that changed a boy's life, but the certainty that even in the coldest medieval night, there will always be a flame for those who dare to seek it. The laundress and the polluted river, work and change in the village. I remember Agnes well, the village laundress whose gentle laughter used to echo along the riverbanks like the sound of distant bells. In those days, the river ran clear and cold, mirroring the clouds and the willows that bent to kiss its surface. Its stones were so smooth they seemed polished by time's own hands, and the air always carried the fresh scent of flowing water and homemade soap. There, among baskets of laundry and stories exchanged on the breeze, village life moved in a tranquil rhythm, like the swaying of leaves at dusk. But as the seasons passed, something began to change. It did not happen suddenly or with a crash, but rather like a persistent whisper that only Agnes seemed to hear. The once crystalline water turned murky, almost melancholic, and a bitter stench, hard to ignore, crept into the air. Clothes that had shone under the sun now emerged from the river stained and heavy, as if the water itself was sick. Many villagers dismissed it as her imagination, saying rivers have their whims. But Agnes, her eyes as attentive as her calloused hands, knew something was deeply wrong. She tried to warn her neighbors. Speaking calmly, almost shyly, she scrubbed sheets on the river stones and insisted that the water no longer sang as before, that there was an eerie silence of fish and a weight in the air that defied explanation. Some laughed. Others merely shook their heads, claiming life had always been hard and that the river was simply reflecting the world, clear at times, dark at others. But Agnes did not laugh. There was a seriousness in her gaze, the same care she took when mending the most worn garments, as though even small tears deserved attention before they became irreparable. Still, she did not give up. She began rising earlier, when mist still lay upon the banks, watching the river as if seeking its secrets. One morning, she found strange debris among the stones, fragments of leather, ashes, and even a piece of cloth stained dark. She sighed, feeling the river's chill run through her fingers, and realized it was no mere whim of nature. It was the work of people. And though no one else in the village wanted to acknowledge it, she knew something had to be done. So Agnes sought help. First, she spoke with the miller, whose water wheel spun just downstream. He stroked his beard, listened, and simply shrugged. "So long as the water flows, that's enough," he said, measuring the world by the turning of wooden paddles. Next she approached the midwife, an old wise woman who knew more of herbs than any priest knew of scripture. The midwife squeezed Agnes's hand and murmured, "If the river falls ill, sooner or later we will too." But even her warning failed to move the entire village to action. Thus Agnes continued to keep watch alone. She washed clothes, but also gathered every scrap of waste she found, as if she could heal the river with her own hands. There was something quietly heroic about her. Bare feet in the mud, aprons soaked through, and a vigilant look as though speaking to a wounded friend. Sometimes I saw her kneeling by the water's edge, washing not only laundry, but her own despair, while the night breeze tossed her grey hair and the moon looked down with a conspiratorial glow. Over time, some began to notice small changes. Children who once played in the river returned home itching, and fish, once plentiful, dwindled so that fishermen came back with nearly empty baskets. Yet many closed their eyes to the truth, preferring to believe it was merely a bad spell, a prank of nature. Only Agnes persisted, her voice steady but never harsh, like the river's current that tirelessly flows over the same stones day after day. One afternoon, she gathered a handful of neighbors by the riverbank. She brought stained cloth scraps, a bucket of dark water, and even a small dead fish, its body stiff with what had befallen it. "See for yourselves," she said without anger, only a calm sorrow impossible to ignore. And for a brief moment, respectful silence fell, as if everyone finally heard the faint murmur of the river begging for help. That night, the news spread through the village like sparks in dry straw. Some still laughed, calling Agnes a dreamer, but others, especially mothers with young children, began to regard the river with unease. It wasn't just the water's murky hue or the odd smell carried on the breeze. It was the sense that something essential, something that had always been there, was slipping away. No one wanted to be the first to admit Agnes had been right from the start. Then the blacksmith, a quiet man known for his strength, spoke up during an impromptu gathering at the tavern. In his deep voice, he confessed he'd noticed it too. Metal rusted faster, tools weakened when washed there. It was no superstition. A murmur of concern spread among the crowd. For the first time, Agnes was not alone. The village began to heed the laundress's soft voice, and with it, the river's weary lament. With this newfound attention, small acts began to follow. Fishermen cast nets farther downstream, fearing the tainted water. Housewives boiled their water before cooking, and even children, usually lost in their games, started asking why the river no longer glinted in the sun. Agnes watched with a mixture of hope and apprehension. It was not a solution, but it was a beginning, like the first ray of light piercing a thick winter fog. Determined, she proposed something bold. that everyone help clean the river. Many scoffed, others grumbled they had no time for such folly. Yet a handful of neighbours stayed. Thus on a cold morning, Agnes waded in with her calloused hands, joined by those who believed her. They gathered leather scraps, wood fragments, soot, and all manner of debris from the banks. The work was grueling, but no one complained. Instead, there was a quiet satisfaction in seeing the river slowly regain a measure of dignity. The following days bore witness to a silent movement. Each dawn, Agnes arrived before anyone else, basket in hand, hair scarfed, feet already in the water when the first neighbours appeared. The river seemed to repay their efforts. Here a clearer reflection, there the cheerful gurgle of a revived stream, even a tentative return of fish. It was no miracle, just hard work, and somehow that effort knit the village together like few things ever had. In time, even the skeptics joined in. The miller brought shovels to dig small diversions that helped purify the flow. The midwife scattered fragrant herbs to mask foul odors, and the blacksmith, who rarely left his anvil, donated buckets for hauling away the waste. Agnes, however, sought no praise. When I saw her smile that late afternoon, hands bruised and skirt dripping, I realized she needed no recognition. She only needed to hear the river sing again, however faintly, like an old lullaby. One morning, as mist lingered over the water, Agnes noticed something new. A flock of white herons, long absent, had returned, perched on the shallow stones. She stood motionless, as if afraid to disturb the scene with a breath. Then she smiled, a serene, almost childlike smile, and plunged a sheet into the water. For the first time in ages, it emerged almost as clean as before the pollution began. It wasn't just the river recovering, it was the village's hope renewed. That night we all gathered by the riverbank. There was no feast, no music, only the sound of flowing water and soft voices, as though none wished to break the magic of the moment. Agnes stood a little apart, hands clasped and eyes glistening, but said nothing. Her silence was a prayer of gratitude, one that asks for nothing, only acknowledges that the world sometimes knows how to heal when tended with patience and love. Weeks turned to months, and the village adopted a new habit, watching over the river as one cares for an old friend. Children learned not to toss scraps on the banks. Fishermen cleaned their nets more carefully. Even the miller, ever practical, remarked that the water tasted lighter. Agnes, meanwhile, continued her work, washing clothes and humming softly, her melodies blending with the river's flow. To her, each clean fold was a small victory, a reminder that even the simplest acts can change a place's destiny. And so, in that small village forgotten by maps, a river became more than water. It became memory, lesson, and promise. Whenever I pass by and see Agnes by the water's edge, barefoot and serene, I feel that the world can be healed by quiet deeds and humble care. As the last light of dusk glints on the calm water, I think perhaps that is how it should be. A bit of patience, a bit of faith, and a river singing softly for anyone willing to listen.